MoneyWatch now, new data indicates that millions of homes may be at risk of flooding due to climate change. The analysis conducted by the nonprofit organization First Street claims federal flood maps have underestimated the risk to nearly 15 million homes across the U.S. So CBS MoneyWatch reporter and video producer Irina Ivanova is here to explain just what we have learned about the risk from these latest numbers. So I guess to start off, how does what First Street's discovered, how does their model different from the government maps? Sorry.
So there's quite a bit of difference if we look at these two different data sets. And one of them is the scope. So the maps used by the National Flood Insurance Program don't cover all of the U.S., and many of them don't necessarily get updated very often. This model from the First Street Foundation covers nearly every single property, 98% of the counties in the continental U.S., and it's automatically updating as flood risk increases. So when we look at the difference, according to the First Street Foundation, we have about 14.5 million properties at risk of flooding in the U.S. today. That's about 1 in 10 properties, and that's about 70% more than you would get from looking simply at the government maps.
Some flood experts say they're not surprised by the discrepancy between the two models. Why do you think that is?
So there's a few different reasons for this that came up as we were researching the story. And one of them is FEMA has a limited budget. The agency has been asking for more money from Congress for years, but it just doesn't have the capacity to update maps every single year or map every single region of the U.S. So they pick and choose. They focus on the areas where they think there's the most risk. Now, one report from the National Association of Floodplain Managers earlier this year found that only 1/3 of the U.S. rivers and less than half of coastline had a FEMA flood map associated with it. So there's quite a big gap there. But the other thing is FEMA doesn't really have the authority to unilaterally impose maps. What happens is more like a negotiation. When it's time to update a flood map, it'll present what it's found and the local community can then dispute it. Usually you'll get a map that's some kind of compromise. So a prime example of this is, looking here in New York, we're coming on 8 years out of Hurricane Sandy, which is still the most costly natural disaster in the U.S. Now, FEMA proposed updated maps less than a year after that disaster, and the maps were greatly expanded. Now, the mayor disputed them because they would have put a lot more people in the floodplain, which is costly for homeowners, and the negotiation continues. We're expecting to get a draft map in maybe 2022 or 2023, and then the public will get a chance to comment on that. So that tells you sort of what the process is usually like for FEMA, as well as, what goes into these maps, which aren't necessarily a pure description of the flood risk that you might face.
That's so interesting to me because, whether your property is in an area that's exposed to a flood risk, it shouldn't be sort of something up for debate later on. Like either you run the risk or you don't run the risk, and you should want to know that information. You brought up Superstorm Sandy, and that's what I kept on thinking when I was sort of reading about this story is I remember doing coverage down there, and, I'd go to people's homes or businesses that were destroyed and have to ask, well, where is the ocean from here? Because they weren't anywhere close to the ocean, and they still sustained flood damage. So why was First Street able to do what FEMA hasn't been able to do? Like, how did they gather all their information?
So it should be pointed out that a lot of this data actually exists. It's just not in the hands of the federal government. Over the years, there have been financial institutions, banks, even real estate companies that have come up with their own models to sort of more specifically indicate what the flood risk is, and they're already using it to make decisions about, what properties will get financing and which ones won't. So what First Street is doing is it developed its own model in partnership with a lot of different researchers. This is a peer-reviewed model, and it's making it for the first time available publicly, which is not really something that we had access to up until this point.
Really interesting reporting there. Irina Ivanova, thank you very, very much for your reporting as always. Really fascinating stuff.
Thank you for having me.